Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the bleak, wind-bitten early days of March that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once again in the comforting disarray of our Baker Street lodgings. London's streets outside were slick with rain and soot, a pale mist rolling through the city as if the very air conspired to veil the sins beneath it. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the arm of his chair, his violin abandoned nearby, and his gaze fixed upon the glowing embers in the hearth. It was the kind of silence that could only be broken by the strangest of summons. At precisely 3:30 in the afternoon, Mrs. Hudson appeared with her usual tact and a barely concealed glint of curiosity. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. He wouldn't give a name." "Show him in," Holmes murmured without turning his head, as though he had expected the visit all along. The door opened, and in stepped a man of curious appearance. He was short and stocky, yet possessed an unmistakable refinement in his manner. An air of controlled panic clung to him like static. His hat was crushed in his gloved hands, and his eyes darted from Holmes to myself with restless unease. "My name is Horace Davenant," he said at last, his voice crisp yet trembling. "I am the steward of Glanville Hall in Sussex. I've come regarding a matter of grave urgency. There's been a murder, Mr. Holmes. But the circumstances are, well, they are quite beyond comprehension." Holmes turned then, steepling his fingers and fixing the man with that piercing gaze which had once made a jewel thief confess before uttering a word. "Beyond comprehension, you say? You pique my interest, Mr. Davenant. Please, sit. Now, start at the beginning and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." The man settled into the chair opposite and launched into his tale, each word dropping heavier than the last. "The murder occurred at Glanville Hall, the ancestral estate of Sir Anthony Glanville. Yesterday morning, Sir Anthony was found dead, stabbed through the heart, in the old wine cellar beneath the west wing." "Stabbed?" I asked, "and there were no signs of a struggle?" "None whatsoever, Doctor. What makes it truly impossible is that the cellar had been sealed for nearly 40 years. The door is of solid oak, bolted from the outside. No one could have entered or exited without breaking the lock, and yet it was intact, utterly untouched. It was Sir Anthony himself who ordered it, opened 2 days ago. He claimed he wished to inspect the old casks personally." "And who was with him?" Holmes asked. "No one. He went down alone that morning. We found him hours later, slumped over beside a wine barrel, a dagger buried in his chest." Holmes leaned forward. "And the weapon?" "An antique blade from the Hall's collection. It was usually displayed above the hearth in Sir Anthony's study. Yet it was found beside him in the cellar. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. The place was dry and dusty. The only prints were his own." Holmes stood and paced with deliberate measure, tapping his fingers against his lips. A sealed room, a murder without an escape, and a weapon that traveled down into a room that hadn't been opened in decades. "There is more," Davenant said hoarsely. "This morning, as I went to inspect the room again, I noticed something that chilled me even more than the murder itself. There was a single red rose blooming in the corner of that cellar. A living flower, in a place without sunlight, without soil, without any means to sustain life. I confess I stared at him, struck dumb for a moment. Even Holmes stopped pacing. "A rose?" Holmes repeated, his tone unreadable. "Yes," Davenant whispered. "A full bloom, red as blood." A long silence fell, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Holmes slowly resumed his seat and folded his hands in his lap, eyes gleaming like cold steel. "Tell me, Mr. Davenant," he said quietly, "who else resides at Glanville Hall?" "The household consists of Sir Anthony's niece, Miss Lillian Glanville, a delicate and rather reclusive young woman, her companion and tutor, Mr. Edwin March, the butler, Mr. P. Gough, who has served the family for decades, and 2 maids, Elsie and Clara. That is all." No guests, no visiting relatives, no villagers with access? None. The hall is isolated and seldom hosts outsiders. Sir Anthony was a proud and solitary man. Holmes rose, sweeping his hand toward the door. "Watson, pack your things. We leave for Sussex tonight." "But Holmes," I began, still struggling to grasp the situation. "A rose blooming in a cellar. Do you not find it rather fanciful?" Holmes shot me a glance that was both chided and amused. "Fanciful? My dear Watson, I find it impossible, which makes it the very thing I most wish to understand. When a flower blooms where it should not, something unnatural is at work. And wherever the unnatural appears, so too does deception." He turned to Davenant with a thin smile. "Fear not, Mr. Davenant. We shall unravel the mystery of your sealed cellar, your vanishing blade, and your murderous rose." And with that, the game, so strange, so improbable, and yet so irresistibly compelling, was afoot. Chapter 2. A curious summons to Glanville Hall. The train ride to Sussex was shrouded in a kind of muted tension that Holmes often welcomed, and I found it vaguely oppressive. Rain streaked the windows in thin silvery veins, and the landscape beyond rolled past in indistinct blurs of grey and green. Holmes sat opposite me, cloaked in his usual composure, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in thought. I had long ago learned not to interrupt these periods of reflection. They were the crucible in which his genius simmered. Still, I could not help but revisit the particulars of Mr. Davenant's account. A man was murdered in a sealed room. An antique dagger moved without a trace, and most unsettling of all, a solitary red rose blooming in a place untouched by sunlight. It was the sort of puzzle that defied simple logic, which made it, I knew, all the more invigorating to Holmes. After a long stretch of silence, I ventured a question. "You don't truly believe the rose bloomed there naturally, do you?" Holmes opened his eyes slowly. "No more than I believe Sir Anthony plunged the blade into his own heart while locking himself inside a cellar he had not opened in 40 years. "Then you think it's murder?" "I think it is deliberate, Watson. Whether murder or misdirection, someone has gone to considerable trouble to craft a tableau that would confound ordinary minds." He smiled faintly. "Fortunately, mine is not so easily disordered." We arrived at the small station of Grinstead Hollow as the dusk gathered. A chill breeze drifted off the marshlands, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant smoke. Waiting for us on the platform was Mr. Davenant, now bundled in a dark coat and hat, though still unmistakably tense. "The carriage is ready," he said at once after a brief perfunctory greeting. "Glanville Hall is not far, but the road becomes rough after the crossroads." As we drove through the winding lanes, the trees became twisted and sparse, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The terrain rose and fell in bleak undulations, and a heavy mist had begun to settle upon the ground. Davenant was silent for much of the journey, speaking only once to point out a ruined chapel overgrown with ivy, which he dismissed as the last relic of a forgotten faith. When we finally turned onto the estate's private road, I caught my first glimpse of Glanville Hall. It rose from the earth like something exhumed rather than built. An austere stone structure with a central tower and 2 low wings, its facade choked with creeping vines and stained by the long passage of time. A wrought iron gate groaned as we passed through, and the house loomed ever closer, its windows reflecting no light. The butler, Mr. Gough, greeted us at the door. He was a hollow-eyed man with a voice like parchment. "You are expected," he said simply, and led us into a great hall that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. Miss Lillian Glanville awaited us in the drawing-room, seated beside a low fire. She was a woman of delicate beauty, fair-skinned, raven-haired, with eyes that seemed too large for her narrow face. There was something distant in her manner, a quality I can only describe as detached sorrow. My uncle spoke of Mr. Holmes in the days before he died, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. He said he felt something dark, stirring in the house. He claimed to hear footsteps in the cellar at night, even though no one had the key but himself. Holmes offered a small bow. Madam, when the living claim to hear the dead, it is often the living who should be watched. She smiled faintly. I believe you will find Glanville Hall full of shadows, Mr. Holmes. As we took our leave to inspect the premises, Mr. Edwin March, the niece's companion and tutor, entered the hall from an adjacent corridor. He was a tall, angular man with a scholar's frame and a priest's bearing, black-coated, his hair prematurely grey, and his gaze faintly skeptical. I hope you do not believe there is more to this than tragedy and coincidence, Mr. Holmes, he said with a thin smile. Old houses like this are full of creaks and crevices. The mind is eager to fill them with ghosts. Holmes glanced at him with mild interest. And yet, Mr. March, it was not a ghost who drove a steel blade through Sir Anthony Glanville's heart. March inclined his head. Indeed, though I imagine Scotland Yard would say it was his own hand. They are often eager to conclude such matters, Holmes said. My experience has shown me that truth is rarely so obliging. We were led down into the cellar by Mr. Davenant, who carried a lantern against the creeping dark. The descent was narrow and cold, the walls damp and green with age. At last, the door to the wine cellar came into view, thick oak, iron-banded, with a heavy bolt that screeched as it was drawn back. As we stepped inside, a pungent smell of mildew and cork filled the air. The floor was dry but coated in fine dust. Rows of wine racks lined the stone walls, many empty, others stacked with long-forgotten bottles. And there, at the far corner, precisely as described, lay the spot where Sir Anthony had fallen. There was no blood left now, though I could see a darker patch on the flagstones. A chalk outline indicated the position of the body, and beside it, a stand where the dagger had been recovered. Holmes crouched low, his eyes scanning every surface, every crevice. Remarkably clean, he murmured. Too clean. The dust should have shown some trace of struggle or movement. Yet apart from Sir Anthony's prints near the threshold, the rest of the room is undisturbed. And then we saw it. In the corner, lit by the flickering lantern light, was the rose. It stood improbably tall, its red petals stark against the ash-colored stone. Its stem curved gently, as though it had grown through the cracks in the flagstone floor. Yet there were no cracks, no earth, no pot, nothing to anchor it. I admit I shivered. Holmes leaned in close, examining the flower without touching it. His voice, when he spoke, was thoughtful. Watson, what do you make of it? I make of it nothing, I said honestly. It should not be here. Precisely. It is either a miracle or a message. Davenant said nothing, merely holding the lantern higher as Holmes continued his examination of the area. I will need to see Sir Anthony's study, Holmes said at last, standing and brushing dust from his knees, and the family records if they still exist. He turned to Davenant with a curious glint in his eye. And if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to know what Sir Anthony was doing the day before he descended into this place, whom he spoke to, whom he may have quarreled with, and whether he ever received roses, especially red ones. Davenant nodded grimly. I shall do what I can. As we turned to ascend from the cellar, Holmes paused at the threshold, glancing once more over his shoulder at the impossible flower. It is not the presence of the rose that disturbs me, he said softly. It is why someone wanted it found. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. The study of Sir Anthony Glanville was a room of heavy shadows and older ghosts. A long, narrow space facing the eastern lawn, it bore the unmistakable stamp of a man who valued history, secrecy, and solitude. Dark paneling lined the walls, and a large fireplace dominated the far side of the room, above which hung a series of empty iron hooks, the same hooks, as Davenant confirmed, that had once held the dagger now tied to Sir Anthony's death. Holmes entered without ceremony, striding across the thick rug to the hearth and standing beneath the vacant weapon display. He examined the hooks closely, then turned his gaze downward, inspecting the wooden floor in a tight radius around the fireplace. I observed in silence, not yet daring to interpret the fragments of meaning that danced just beyond comprehension. "Sir Anthony rarely allowed anyone into this room," Davenant said, lingering at the door. "Even Miss Lillian had to knock for entry. He spent hours here each day, particularly in recent months, writing letters, making notes in his journal, reading books in Latin I couldn't even pronounce." "And the dagger?" Holmes asked without looking up. "Was it secured to the wall?" "With brass clasps. It had not been removed in years, or so I believed." Holmes gently fingered one of the clasps. "One has been forced," he said, more to himself than to us. "Bent outward slightly. Someone removed it in haste, perhaps not wishing to leave obvious signs, but failing to preserve the symmetry." "Do you suppose Sir Anthony took it himself?" I asked. Holmes straightened. "I suppose nothing yet, but it is a detail worth preserving." He next turned his attention to the desk, an impressive old piece of mahogany, crowded with papers, an inkstand, a blotter, and several thick tomes. Holmes sat down and began flipping gently through the scattered pages. "Something is unsettling about this place," I murmured, drawn to the tall, dust-streaked window beside the desk. The lawn outside looked pale and formless beneath the fog. "Unsettling," Holmes echoed. "Watson, the entire household is unsettling. A reclusive nobleman died in an impossible room, a silent niece, a tutor too eager to offer rationality. And now this." He plucked a sheet from beneath the blotter and held it aloft. A letter, torn but revealing. I stepped forward and read over his shoulder. The handwriting was rigid and angular. "And though the vision continues to appear by the hearth at the hour of 3, I have resolved not to flee. I will confront the truth, whatever shape it takes. The rose is the key. It blooms where it should not. Let them call me mad. I know what I have seen. It grows not from soil, but memory." Holmes set the sheet down and drummed his fingers lightly on the desk. "What do you make of it?" I asked, frowning. "I make of it a man tormented," Holmes said, "but whether by guilt, delusion, or knowledge remains to be seen. The rose appears again, central, symbolic, possibly literal, and this vision by the hearth. 3 o'clock. "Ghosts?" I asked, half in jest. "Something more dangerous than ghosts, I suspect. Obsession." Holmes pushed the chair back and stood. "We must see the cellar again at precisely 3. I glanced at my watch. 2:30? "Excellent," Holmes replied. "That gives us just enough time to speak with the rest of the household." Our first interview was with the housemaid Clara, a round-faced girl with nervous fingers and a habit of glancing over her shoulder as she spoke. "I didn't see anything, sir," she insisted, wringing her hands. "Only that the master was strange in the days before it happened. He barely ate, spoke to himself, wandered the halls at night." "Did he speak to the rose?" Holmes asked, his voice neutral. Clara looked startled. I don't know. Once I thought I heard him whispering in the corridor, saying, 'Why now? Why return?' But when I stepped out of the kitchen, he was gone." "Did you ever go down into the cellar?" She paled. "No, sir. None of us ever did. He kept the key around his neck, never let it out of his sight." "Thank you, Clara," Holmes said gently. "You may go." Next was Mr. Guff, the butler, whose severe expression and slow, deliberate speech marked him as a man who had seen many masters come and go. "Sir Anthony was changed of late," he admitted. "He received a parcel some weeks ago. From France, I believe. After that, he became absorbed in old books, family records, and things long forgotten. He would speak to no one of it." "What was in the parcel?" "A rose. pressed between vellum pages. Dried, yet perfectly formed. I saw it once before he hid it away. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did he mention where it had come from? Only that it had been found beneath a ruined monastery in Calais, a place, he said, that belonged to the Glanvilles centuries ago. Holmes remained silent for a long moment. "And what of Miss Lillian?" he asked. "How did she react to her uncle's death?" Gough's face became unreadable. With grief as any lady should, but with distance too. They were not close in recent years. And Mr. March? A man of principles, but private. He keeps to the west wing, seldom speaks at the table. He and Sir Anthony did not always agree. Holmes gave a faint nod. That will be all. At exactly 3 o'clock, we descended once more into the cellar. Davenant lit the lantern while Holmes moved slowly about the chamber, pausing occasionally to peer into corners or run a finger along the walls. "Watson, ever faithful," he said to me. "Observe the dust." I looked. The footprint patterns were unchanged, still showing Sir Anthony's descent and collapse. But Holmes pointed to a small trail near the wine rack, barely perceptible, a light brushing of dust as though something had been dragged. Too subtle for a boot or a crate," he muttered. "More like the hem of a gown." I turned sharply. "You mean someone else entered after the body was found?" "Or before," Holmes corrected. "Though how, I do not yet know. There's no alternate exit, yet these faint marks suggest otherwise." The rose still stood untouched. Holmes knelt before it and examined the base again. No stem into the stone, no wire, no evidence of glue. It simply stands. He reached into his coat and produced a small magnifying lens. After several moments of silent study, he stood again, brushing dust from his knees. "I believe we have now seen enough to proceed," he said at last. "The clues are not yet aligned, but they are present. Someone within this house knows what truly happened to Sir Anthony Glanville, and they are growing nervous." "What gives you that impression?" I asked. Holmes turned toward the open cellar door, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure at the top of the stairs, a shadow, tall and still, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "We are being watched," Holmes said quietly. "And in this house, Watson, that is both dangerous and revealing." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The parlor of Glanville Hall, a once grand chamber now faded by years of neglect, served as the stage for Holmes's next maneuver. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting the room in warm flickers that could not entirely banish the long shadows that clung to the high, oak-paneled walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like memory held too long in closed spaces. By Holmes's request, the principal inhabitants of the house had been gathered. It was not a formal interrogation, not yet. Rather, a subtle performance, with Holmes as conductor and the rest of us as an audience to unease. Miss Lillian Glanville sat poised in a high-backed chair near the fire, her black skirts perfectly arranged, her pale hands folded in her lap. There was a peculiar stillness to her, as though she had mastered the art of invisibility without leaving the room. She watched Holmes with quiet intensity, betraying neither suspicion nor fear, only an inscrutable calm. Mr. Edwin March, the tutor, leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. His expression was one of polite disinterest, but there was something too carefully measured about it. He responded to questions with the precision of a man used to debate, but never volunteered more than was asked. Gough, the butler, stood just inside the doorway, rigid, formal, his eyes flicking from speaker to speaker like a chess player watching the middle game unfold. Clara, the maid, lingered near the tea tray, clearly nervous but eager to listen. Elsie, the second maid, had taken ill that morning and was confined to her quarters, a fact Holmes noted without comment. Holmes, pacing slowly before the hearth, began his inquiry not with accusation, but with apparent curiosity. "Forgive my directness," he said, "but I must ask you all to reflect upon the days preceding Sir Anthony's death. Were there any visitors, letters, unusual events, however small?" There was a pause. "I recall no visitors," said March, adjusting his spectacles. "Sir Anthony valued his solitude." "True," said Miss Glanville, her voice gentle. "Though he received a parcel from the continent not long before, he grew even more withdrawn after its arrival." "The parcel," Holmes echoed. "What became of it?" "I believe he locked it away," she replied. "Perhaps in his writing desk. I never saw it again." "And did he say anything of its contents?" Miss Glanville hesitated. "Only that it contained something from our family's past, something he thought long buried." Holmes turned to March. "Did you notice a change in him?" "Of course. He was unsettled, preoccupied. He seemed almost haunted, if you'll forgive the expression. He took to walking the corridors at night, often barefoot, murmuring to himself." "Did he speak of the cellar?" March nodded. "Yes. He believed there was something waiting for him there, something that had returned. Frankly, I thought he was slipping into delusion." Holmes gave a thin smile. "You are not the first to mistake madness for revelation, Mr. March." He pivoted to Guff. "And you? You've served the family longest, I believe." 42 years, Goff said. "Sir Anthony was a proud man, secretive, but he was no fool. He feared something, though he would not name it." "Did you ever witness him, speaking to the rose?" A flicker crossed Guff's face, subtle, but not invisible to Holmes's eyes. "I heard him whispering in the study," the butler said slowly. "Once. He held something in his hand, something green and curled, and he said, 'Not again, not here.' I thought it best not to ask." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and resumed pacing. "And yet someone in this house placed a rose in a cellar sealed from within. A living rose, impossible, unnatural. Symbolic, a message, perhaps, or a promise." He let the words hang in the air. No one spoke. "It was not Sir Anthony who placed it there," Holmes continued. "I am certain of that. He descended alone. The rose was waiting, which means one of you, someone in this house, found a way to place it there before the door was ever opened." "But how?" Clara blurted, her eyes wide. "There's no other way in. Mr. Davenant said—" "Exactly," Holmes said sharply. "No obvious way in, which makes the act all the more deliberate and cunning." Miss Glanville's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "are you suggesting that one of us killed my uncle?" Holmes met her gaze. "I'm suggesting that someone knew he would die." Another silence followed, tense, heavy. Holmes then moved toward the tea tray where Clara stood fidgeting. He picked up the pot and examined it briefly. "Who last prepared tea for Sir Anthony?" he asked. "I did, sir," Clara said. "The morning he died, just before he went down to the cellar." "And did he drink it?" "I think so. The cup was empty afterward." Holmes set the pot down and gave her a tight smile. "It's often in the ordinary that we find the most deceit." "Thank you." Clara turned pale but said nothing. As the group began to disperse, Holmes gently touched my arm and motioned toward the hallway. We left the parlor together, stepping into the long, echoing corridor beyond. "Well?" I asked in a low voice. "What do you make of them?" "Each wears a mask," Holmes said. "Miss Glanville is too composed, Mr. March too reasonable, Guff too loyal, and Clara, she's afraid of something. But not the murder." "You think she knows?" "I think she suspects. Perhaps more." We paused at the base of the stairs. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Somewhere above, the floorboards groaned faintly, as though someone had just shifted their weight. Holmes glanced up, his voice low. "Someone is listening. They know we're getting close." "To what?" He smiled faintly. to why a man would die with an antique dagger in a sealed cellar, and why a rose would bloom there, as if by invitation. Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring. The next morning broke with a dreary drizzle, and Glanville Hall lay muffled beneath a sky the colour of pewter. Holmes rose earlier than usual, already dressed and studying the fireplace in Sir Anthony's study by the time I emerged from the guest chambers. He had not slept. Of that I was certain. There was a sharpness to his gaze, a kinetic tension in his frame that meant a theory was forming, though not yet complete. "You recall, Watson," he said as I entered, "that we were being watched yesterday in the cellar." "I do," I said. "You think the shadow we saw belonged to someone with something to hide?" "Precisely. But fear often masquerades as concern, or loyalty, or even grief." He turned back to the hearth. "Tell me, Watson, why would a man bolt himself into a cellar, one he had sealed for decades, armed only with a blade from his wall, and die there with no sign of a struggle?" I hesitated. Perhaps. He did intend to face something he thought real, even if only in his own mind. Holmes gave a faint smile. "And yet the rose. The rose is not a figment. It is very real, and very deliberate. Someone placed it there to shape the scene, to frame the meaning of the death." Before I could press further, a knock came at the study door. It was Inspector Lestrade. "Holmes," he said, stepping in with his usual abruptness and brushing rain from his sleeves. "I came as soon as I received word. Your telegram said it was a case of impossible death and botanical absurdity. I assume that wasn't a jest." Holmes gestured him in. "No jest, Inspector. Sir Anthony Glanville is dead, stabbed in the heart, found in a cellar sealed from the outside, no intruder, no exit, and a rose, fresh and crimson, growing without soil where none should bloom." Lestrade blinked. "You might have led with the stabbing." Holmes explained the broad strokes of the case while Lestrade listened with increasing skepticism, though he knew better than to dismiss anything Holmes found curious. "Well, it sounds like madness to me," Lestrade concluded, "and I dare say we already have a suspect." "Oh?" Holmes asked, arching a brow. "Clara," Lestrade said. "The maid. The last person to serve Sir Anthony tea. That's what Davenant told me. The cup was clean, but the timing's convenient. And you said he got a parcel from abroad? Poison could have come in that too." Holmes looked unimpressed. "And yet he died from a stab wound, not ingestion. Maybe she lured him down there, then stabbed him. They say she had access to the key once or twice before. It wouldn't be hard to steal a copy." "Convenient," Holmes murmured. "Too convenient. Clara is frightened, yes, but her fear is reactive, not guilty." Lestrade shrugged. "Regardless, I'll question her properly." Clara was brought into the morning room. She looked pale but composed, her apron twisted nervously in her hands. "Miss Clara," Lestrade began, "where were you on the morning of Sir Anthony's death?" "In the kitchen, sir," she said quietly. "I made his tea just after breakfast, took it to the study myself." "Did you notice anything odd about him?" Clara nodded. "He was pale, sweating, talking under his breath. Said he had to confront something at last. I asked if he was unwell, but he just waved me off." "And you never entered the cellar?" "Never, sir. I never even wanted to. It frightened me." Lestrade leaned forward. "Clara, did you know that someone saw a figure at the top of the stairs while we were in the cellar yesterday?" Clara's eyes widened. "No, sir. I wasn't anywhere near there." Holmes interjected. "Was Elsie in her room at the time?" Clara hesitated. "Yes, but she hadn't been herself lately. She started talking strangely after the master died. Said she'd heard him calling at night, even after he was gone." Lestrade frowned. "You think she's hiding something?" I don't know. She won't talk to anyone now. Stays locked in her room." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Thank you, Clara," he said gently. "That will be all for now." After she left, Lestrade exhaled. A nervous wreck, but I still think she's our best lead. Holmes shook his head. She's a frightened girl caught in a web not of her making. But I'll admit this much. Someone in this house is tightening the noose. We must act before they strike again. Later that afternoon, Holmes requested access to the servants' quarters. The narrow hallway leading to the attic rooms was quiet and dimly lit. We reached Elsie's door, shut and locked from the inside. Holmes knocked gently. "Miss Elsie, it's Sherlock Holmes. I'd like a word." No response. He knocked again. "I'm here to help, not to accuse." A faint rustle came from within. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Elsie stood in the shadow beyond, pale, thin, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She looked like a woman teetering on the edge of some hidden cliff. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I believe you," Holmes said. "But I think you saw something." She trembled. "Tell me," he said gently. Elsie's voice quivered. "The night before he died, I saw Miss Lillian." Holmes didn't move. "Go on." "She was in the corridor. Late, just past midnight. She was carrying something in her arms, a bundle like cloth. She went toward the stairwell near the old chapel wing. That stair leads down to the wine cellar." Holmes frowned. "But the cellar door was locked." "She had a key," Elsie said. I only saw it when the light caught the brass." "You're certain it was Miss Lillian?" "I'd swear it, but I said nothing. I thought maybe it was innocent. But then the next day he was dead, and the rose—" She shivered again. Holmes touched her arm lightly. "You've been brave, Elsie. Say nothing of this for now. Let us do the rest." That evening, Holmes and I returned to the parlor, where Miss Lillian was seated once more by the fire, leafing through a volume of poetry. "Miss Glanville," Holmes said, "I must ask you plainly. Did you enter the cellar on the night before your uncle's death?" Her eyes didn't leave the book. "Why would I do such a thing, Mr. Holmes? You tell me." She closed the book slowly and met his gaze. "No, Mr. Holmes, I did not. A witness says otherwise." "Then your witness is mistaken." Holmes studied her face. "And yet the rose, symbol of passion, memory, or perhaps guilt, blooms only after your visit. Curious." Miss Glanville stood then, brushing her skirt smooth. "I'm afraid I've nothing more to say, Mr. Holmes." He bowed slightly. "For now, that is quite sufficient." As she left the room, Holmes turned to me. "She's lying, Watson, but not about the murder." "Then what is she hiding?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Something older than murder. Something bound to that rose and that cellar and whatever truth Sir Anthony feared to face. But make no mistake, Miss Lillian is not our culprit." "Then who?" Holmes stepped toward the fire, his voice low and certain. "Someone with deeper roots in this place, someone who knew that in planting a rose where it could not bloom, they might sow confusion instead of questions." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. Morning light filtered through the rain-dappled windows of Glanville Hall as Holmes stood motionless by the French doors, gazing out over the drenched gardens. The air inside the house was heavier than before, as though the mansion itself now bore the weight of secrets too long held. The housekeeper passed quietly down the hallway, her footsteps muted by the thick runner rug. From somewhere deep within the manor came the faint ticking of an ancient grandfather clock, counting each moment with solemn inevitability. Holmes had barely touched his tea, a sure sign that something troubled him. "I've been reviewing the facts," he said at last, "and something refuses to align, something that feels out of rhythm with the rest." "Elsie's account?" I asked. "Not just that." Holmes turned to face me. "Several inconsistencies plague this case, one in particular that we must now address." He stepped to the writing desk and retrieved a folded page from his pocket. Sir Anthony's last telegram, sent from Cairo. You recall this message, Watson? He asked, unfolding it with precision. I must confront the truth buried in blood and roses. If I do not write again, tell Lillian the Glanville name is hers. Yes, I said, reading over his shoulder. The phrasing is dramatic, but unmistakable. Holmes nodded. Too unmistakable. I frowned. You suspect it was not written by him? Quite the contrary. It was written by him. But I suspect it was never meant for us, not in its original form. That message was intercepted or altered in its transmission. He pointed to the signature. Sir Anthony always signed as A.G. in his notes, never his full name. And this signature is oddly centered, not right-aligned as customary in his style. Furthermore, the use of buried in blood and roses. That's not typical of his prose, which was always clipped, formal, military. But if it was sent from Cairo, I began. Then either someone in his company tampered with the note, Holmes concluded, or Sir Anthony knew he was being watched and wrote cryptically on purpose. There was a silence. Holmes went on. But now let us return to something tangible. That rose. He led me once again into the study, and we descended the creaking stairwell to the cellar. The flickering gaslight overhead still threw distorted shadows against the damp stone walls. The rose had wilted slightly overnight, yet even in death, its petals clung defiantly to their scarlet bloom. Holmes knelt beside it, withdrawing a small folding magnifier from his coat pocket. Observe, he murmured. This root, though appearing embedded, was planted into a drilled crevice in the stone. A touch of moss and mortar disguised it, and the soil residue around it, still damp. This rose was planted after the death. Planned to be discovered, that eliminates suicide. Someone wanted this to appear ritualistic. He stood and faced me. Now ask yourself, Watson, who had the means and the symbolic knowledge to place a rose in a locked cellar? I suppose anyone familiar with the Glanville legacy. Exactly, Holmes said, and that list grows smaller with every hour. Later that afternoon, we called upon the family solicitor, Mr. Charles Pennington, who had arrived from London to oversee the reading of the will. A man of orderly hair and disorderly spectacles, Pennington greeted us in the drawing-room with some reluctance. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Pennington, I wonder if I might see the last will of Sir Anthony Glanville. The solicitor blinked behind his thick lenses. Well, the reading is scheduled for tomorrow, but if you insist... He retrieved the document from his case and passed it to Holmes, who opened it carefully and read in silence. Ah, he murmured. As expected. I leaned in. What is it, Holmes? Sir Anthony left the estate to his niece, Miss Lillian Glanville. But more curiously, there is a clause. Should Lillian perish under unnatural circumstances before her 25th birthday, the estate shall pass instead to Reginald Davenant. Pennington adjusted his spectacles. A rather grim stipulation, yes. I warned Sir Anthony against it, but he insisted, said he needed safeguards in place. Holmes looked up sharply. And Davenant knew of this? Pennington hesitated. Not officially, though Sir Anthony was not discreet with his distrust. I believe Davenant suspected something to that effect. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then Davenant had motive. If not for Sir Anthony's death, then perhaps for the next. That evening, Holmes requested that Davenant join us in the conservatory for a brief conversation. The tutor arrived, tall and stiff-backed, as if prepared for cross-examination. I understand you studied botany in your Oxford days, Holmes said conversationally. Davenant raised a brow. I did. Why? Only that the rose found beside Sir Anthony's body appears to have been transplanted with care, almost surgical precision. The cut to the stem, the anchoring into the crevice, the concealment with moss. These are not the acts of an amateur. Davenant folded his arms. And you suspect me? Holmes smiled faintly. I suspect capability, Mr. Davenant. The matter of intent remains uncertain. Davenant bristled. "If you believe I had anything to do with this ridiculous affair, then your reputation is sorely inflated. I came here to teach a child poetry and mathematics, not play villain in some ghost story." Holmes's gaze remained steady. "You came here for stability, yes. But you also came here with debts, did you not?" Davenant flinched, almost imperceptibly. "Debts," Holmes repeated. "That might be erased by the inheritance of an estate as grand as Glanville Hall." "I owe nothing you could prove," Davenant said tightly, and turned to leave. When he was gone, I exhaled. "Do you think he's guilty?" Holmes shook his head. "He is arrogant, possibly desperate. But he did not kill Sir Anthony. He lacks one crucial trait for such a deed." "What's that?" "Patience." Just before midnight, Holmes asked for a candle and led me once more to Sir Anthony's private chambers. We entered in silence, guided only by the flickering flame. Holmes moved straight to the great oak wardrobe, opened it, and began scanning the floor. "There," he said. I followed his finger to a dislodged plank near the back. He pried it up with a penknife, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside lay a small, leather-bound book, dusty and cracked with age. Holmes opened it reverently, revealing page after page of careful notes. Dates, symbols, strange names, pressed flowers, some ancient, brittle to the touch. And on the final page, the Glanville blood bears a debt, one paid not in coin, but in remembrance. The roses must bloom as proof, and in their bloom, the guilt of centuries. We stared at the words in silence. Holmes closed the book slowly. "It is not just a murder, Watson. It is an inheritance soaked in old crimes. Someone believes Sir Anthony was close to unveiling that history. And killed him to stop it?" Holmes's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Or to claim it." Chapter 7. The Whispered Confession. The shadows deepened across Glanville Hall as a slow wind moaned through the corridors. Somewhere within the ancient bones of the manor, a door creaked, soft, uncertain. I had long since stopped trusting the ordinary sounds of the house. They seemed to echo with intent, as though the building itself had been drawn into the mystery. Holmes sat in an armchair near the fire, the leather-bound journal of Sir Anthony open in his lap. I watched the flames dance across his face, throwing sharp shadows beneath his cheekbones. He hadn't spoken in some time. "What do you make of it?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, without looking up, he said, "Watson, do you remember the name Eleanor Brandt from the family portrait gallery?" I frowned, thinking, "Yes. I believe her portrait was tucked away in a narrow corner upstairs, a young woman dressed in mourning black with a pale ribbon in her hair." Holmes nodded. "And no plaque beneath her image, unlike the others." I thought it an oversight. "Not an oversight," he said quietly. "A deliberate omission. Eleanor Brandt was Sir Anthony's great-aunt, disowned after an alleged affair with a man from a rival house. It was whispered she fled with family secrets. Secrets tied to an incident during the Second Afghan War. And now," he tapped the journal. "Her name appears 3 times here, always in connection with this cryptic phrase, 'The Harrow gift shall pass in blood, never in ink.'" I leaned forward. "The Harrow gift?" "Precisely. A term repeated throughout the journal, but never defined. I believe it refers to something inherited, but not in a legal or material sense. More likely, a knowledge, perhaps a ritual, or a curse." "Good Lord." Holmes snapped the journal shut and stood. "We must speak with Lillian." We found her in the west garden, despite the chill. Wrapped in a deep blue shawl, she stood before the stone sundial, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. Holmes approached softly. "Miss Glanville," he said, "may I ask, do you know the name Eleanor Brandt?" Her shoulders stiffened. "She was mentioned only once to me," Lillian said after a pause. by my uncle, years ago. He said she was a lesson in disobedience, that her blood ran wrong. I thought it a metaphor. Was it? Holmes asked gently. Lillian looked away. Uncle Anthony wasn't a cruel man, Mr. Holmes, but he carried certain convictions. Family meant control, lineage, duty. Anyone who threatened that order became erased, like Eleanor, like others. Holmes leaned forward. Did he ever mention something called the Harrow gift? That struck a nerve. She stepped back, lips parting in a silent breath. Where did you hear that? She whispered. In his journal, Holmes replied. He wrote as though it was something sacred or dangerous. Lillian hesitated, then lowered her voice. He believed there was a legacy beyond the estate, a truth carried through the women of the Glanville line, not through name or title, but through memory. Eleanor was the last woman to hold the gift, as far as he knew, until me. I felt a chill pass through me. Holmes said, "And what is it, this gift?" Lillian shook her head. He never told me, only that I would know when the time came. He said the roses would bloom when the blood has settled. I thought he was being poetic, but now I wonder if he knew he was going to die. Holmes looked thoughtful. I believe he feared he had uncovered something the family wished to forget, and that knowledge got him killed. That night, Holmes requested that Elsie, the maid, meet with us privately in the library. She arrived with her apron freshly pressed and her expression rigidly neutral, but I noticed her fingers trembled as she smoothed her skirt. Elsie, Holmes began, I must ask you to speak plainly. You were the first to discover Sir Anthony's body. Yet I suspect there's more you saw than you reported. She blinked rapidly. Sir, I do not mean the rose, Holmes said gently, but rather something else. Perhaps something you noticed in the hour before his death. A conversation, a visitor. Elsie glanced at me, then back at Holmes. There was a sound from the study. I was passing the hall just before 10. I heard Sir Anthony arguing, not loudly, but he sounded frightened. With whom? I don't know. The door was shut. I didn't want to intrude. Did you hear any words? She hesitated, then nodded. He said, You dare bring that name here again? And the other voice said, You should have destroyed the journal. Holmes and I exchanged a look. Did you recognize the other voice? I thought it sounded like Mr. Davenant, but I can't be sure. Holmes didn't react. He merely offered her a kind nod. You've been most helpful, Elsie. When she had gone, I said, Davenant again? Holmes turned to the fire, silent. No, he said at last. Davenant is clever, but not clever enough. This conversation suggests someone who knew about the journal, someone who feared it. He stared into the flames. Watson, fetch me Pennington's card. I must wire London. I believe the key to this lies not in who killed Sir Anthony, but who feared what he knew. The next morning brought heavy skies, the kind that press against one's shoulders. A knock came at the door just after breakfast, and a telegram was handed to Holmes. He read it once, twice, then handed it to me. From Inspector Strathern, Scotland Yard. Pennington Charles. Investigation confirmed. Alias, Charles Harrow. Disbarred, 1898 for forgery. Current occupation unknown. Likely impostor. Caution advised. I looked up in disbelief. Pennington? The solicitor? Not a solicitor, Holmes said grimly. A fraud, and if I'm correct, the heir of the Harrow line, possibly even a descendant of Eleanor Brandt's forbidden union. That would make him not just a liar, but a claimant to the very legacy Sir Anthony tried to protect. And he forged his way into the family's affairs. Yes, likely intercepted Sir Anthony's telegram, manipulated legal documents, perhaps even orchestrated the murder. Holmes's face was stone. And he's still here. Outside, thunder rolled across the moors like the slow breath of some ancient beast. Holmes stood and buttoned his coat. It's time to unmask the ghost-haunting Glanville Hall. Chapter 8. The Man Behind the Mask. The wind clawed at the window panes of Glanville Hall, dragging clouds of mist across the lawn like veils of mourning. Holmes stood at the library's tall windows, hands clasped behind his back, his reflection sharp and brooding in the rain-flecked glass. Behind him, I watched the fire dwindle, the room's warmth failing to chase away the chill that had settled with the news of Charles Pennington's deception. Charles Harrow, Holmes murmured, a disbarred forger, a man with no legal right to anything, yet bold enough to insert himself into the final dealings of a dying baronet, and clever enough to play the part of solicitor without suspicion. Until now. "What will you do?" I asked. Holmes turned. "Now, Watson, we shall confront him, but we must do so carefully. Men like Harrow do not act alone. There is a thread yet unseen in this tapestry, and I fear if we pull it too soon, the whole affair may unravel without justice being served." We found Harrow, in the drawing-room. Poring over a stack of papers by the hearth, his brow furrowed in theatrical concern. He looked up as we entered and affected a polite smile. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I trust you're settling in despite the somber circumstances." Holmes stepped forward. "Indeed, though I'm afraid it is precisely those circumstances I must discuss. You see, I've been conducting an inquiry of my own." Harrow's smile faltered. "An inquiry?" "Yes, into your background." Silence fell like a blade. The room seemed to tighten around us. "I beg your pardon?" Harrow said, eyes narrowing. "You may beg all you like," Holmes said coolly, "but you'll find no pardon here. Your name is not Charles Pennington, solicitor of the firm Pennington & Howe. That man, I've confirmed, died 6 years ago. You, sir, are Charles Harrow, disbarred, convicted of forgery, and presently engaged in a most insidious impersonation." A flicker of alarm crossed Harrow's face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He chuckled. "What an extraordinary accusation, Mr. Holmes. I trust you've proof of such a fantastic claim." "I do. Scotland Yard has confirmed your true identity. I hold the wire in my possession." Holmes stepped closer, his voice darkening. "Now tell me, what is your connection to Eleanor Brent?" At the mention of the name, Harrow's composure cracked. His mouth twitched and a muscle leapt in his jaw. But still he said nothing. Holmes pressed on. "You are a descendant, are you not? A direct result of the union Sir Anthony sought to erase from family history. You did not come to settle his affairs. You came to claim what you believe was stolen from you, the Harrow gift." "Enough," Harrow snapped. Rising suddenly from the chair, "You know nothing of it. You read the surface of things, but you do not understand what lies beneath." "Then enlighten me," Holmes said, unmoved. Harrow's chest heaved once, then fell still. "It wasn't about money. Not entirely. The Glanville estate is symbolic. My grandmother was Eleanor's daughter, raised in silence, taught to forget her lineage. But my mother remembered. She kept Eleanor's letters, cryptic things, filled with references to the gift. She believed there was something hidden in this house, something that would prove our bloodlines right to the legacy." "So you forged your way in," I said. "Used your legal knowledge to manipulate your way to the inner circle." "I had to. No one would listen otherwise. Anthony was obsessed with bloodlines and purity. He would have destroyed any evidence of us, just as his father destroyed Eleanor's name." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And when he discovered you, he threatened to expose you. So you killed him?" "No," Harrow shouted, the denial sharp and immediate. "I didn't kill him. I swear it on what's left of my name. I confronted him, yes, demanded he release the journal, acknowledge the truth. He refused, but he was alive when I left. I went back to my rooms. I never saw him again. There was a raw desperation in his voice that I could not dismiss. Holmes regarded him coolly. "If you are lying, Harrow, you will hang for it. But if you are not, then someone else feared what Anthony knew, and they struck first." That night, Holmes and I reviewed the case in his rooms. A storm raged beyond the windows, hammering the glass and groaning through the chimneys. "Do you believe him?" I asked. Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled. "Partially. Harrow is no innocent. His entire life is built on deceit. But I do not believe he killed Sir Anthony." "But the evidence is circumstantial," Holmes said. "And there is one element that continues to gnaw at me. The rose." "The rose?" I frowned. "Yes, a single crimson rose placed upon Sir Anthony's chest. Not a natural gesture, not something one does in panic or rage. It was deliberate, symbolic. Lillian mentioned Sir Anthony believed the roses bloomed when blood had settled." Holmes nodded slowly. "And that the gift passes through women, not men. Perhaps Sir Anthony's final act was not resistance, but offering. Perhaps he knew the end was near and wished to pass something on. To whom?" "To the true heir," Holmes said, standing suddenly. "Watson, do you recall what Miss Lillian said? That the gift is remembered, that it lies in memory, not paper." "Yes?" Holmes turned to me, a glint of urgency in his eye. "Then the answer is not in the journal. It is in her. And if I'm right, someone else suspects the same." We found Lillian in the North Gallery, standing before Eleanor Brandt's portrait. A lantern burned beside her, casting long shadows on the floor. She turned as we approached, startled. "Mr. Holmes?" "You're not safe," Holmes said without preamble. "Someone believes you carry something, perhaps knowledge, that must not come to light. Have you noticed anything unusual? Any messages, missing belongings?" She nodded slowly. "This morning, a drawer in my uncle's desk had been forced open. His signet ring was missing. It was always kept there." Holmes's face darkened. "The ring, of course. The bearer's seal, an heir's symbol." We all turned at the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. A figure appeared in the archway, drenched from the rain, cloak dripping, eyes wild. It was Margaret Glanville. "Stay away from her," she cried, pointing at Lillian. Holmes stepped forward. "Miss Glanville, what is this?" "You don't understand," she said, voice trembling. "She was never meant to have it. The gift, it belongs to the elder line, to me." Lillian's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I followed him that night," Margaret whispered. "Uncle Anthony. I heard him speaking to you, heard him say you were the last, that he was leaving it to you. After all I did to preserve this family's legacy." Holmes moved slowly, positioning himself between the two women. "You took the ring," he said softly. "You tried to erase her, as Eleanor was erased, and when that failed, you killed him." Margaret's expression twisted. Grief, rage, desperation. Then she turned and fled into the shadows of the hall. Holmes darted after her. Chapter 9. The flight through the hall. The echo of Margaret Glanville's footsteps ricocheted through the vaulted corridors of Glanville Hall, sharp and frantic. Holmes bolted after her, his coat flaring behind him like a shadow. I followed, my boots thudding against the old oak floors, heart hammering. "Margaret," Holmes called ahead, "you cannot outrun the truth." But she didn't answer. She turned sharply at the end of the gallery, pushing through a door that led to the west wing, a part of the house long disused, sealed by dust and neglect. We burst in moments later, the air musty and cloying. The hall stretched before us, darkened by time and unlit by any lamps. We moved quickly, the beam from Holmes's lantern sweeping along cracked portraits, covered furniture, and tattered tapestries. "She knows these halls better than we do," I muttered. She's heading for the chapel, Holmes said, not slowing. There's only one place in Glanville Hall where truth and legacy are bound in ritual, beneath the stone vaults of the family crypt. The storm outside howled louder, as if the house itself were reacting to the unveiling of its secrets. A gust of wind forced open a shutter ahead of us, revealing Margaret's fleeting silhouette disappearing through a low-arched doorway. We followed. The old chapel loomed at the end of the corridor, its stone structure older than the rest of the estate. Once a place of family rites and mourning, it had not seen a ceremony in decades. Ivy coiled through cracks in the stained glass windows, and the altar stood draped in cobwebs. Yet the presence of something sacred, or perhaps forgotten, still lingered. The door to the crypt beneath stood open. Lantern in hand, Holmes descended first, and I behind him. The air grew colder with each step. Damp stones lined the spiral staircase, leading down to a vaulted chamber lit only by flickering candle stubs. At the center stood Margaret, her back to us, one hand resting on an old sarcophagus carved with the Glanville crest. "You should not have come," she said without turning. Her voice was low, almost reverent. Holmes stepped forward. "It's over, Miss Glanville. The truth has outrun your intentions." She turned slowly then, and in her hand gleamed Sir Anthony's signet ring, its red stone dull in the candlelight. "I was meant to carry it," she said. "The family name, the legacy. I preserved it, followed the rules, protected our bloodline from disgrace." "By spilling that blood?" I asked, stepping beside Holmes. She flinched. "I didn't mean to. He said he was going to name her heir in the codicil. Said the gift belonged to her. A girl from Eleanor's line, illegitimate, cast out, erased from every page of our history. How could he betray everything we were?" Holmes's gaze remained steady. "So you confronted him?" "Yes," she said quietly. "In his study. I pleaded with him to reconsider, to remember our duty, but he refused. He told me it was already done, that the codicil would be sent to his solicitor, sent to that impostor, Pennington." "So you killed him," Holmes said, voice like steel. She didn't deny it. "I pushed him. He fell, struck his head on the edge of the writing desk. I didn't plan it, but when I saw him lying there, bleeding, I knew what I had to do." "The rose," Holmes said. She nodded. He always believed in the old stories, that the gift awakened when the right blood touched earth. I thought, if I placed the rose there, maybe it would be seen as fate, that the gift had been denied her. Holmes stepped toward her slowly. "And the codicil?" "I burned it," she said. "The moment I found it. It named Lillian, my own cousin, a girl raised far from this house, unaware of what it meant to be a Glanville." I could see the conflict in her face, not merely guilt, but the sorrow of a life spent serving a family myth that had rejected her in its final chapter. "She carries the true gift," Holmes said gently. "Not because of her name, but because of her memory, her empathy, the very qualities your uncle saw and you buried beneath tradition." Margaret looked at the ring one last time. Then, with a sigh, she dropped it onto the stone sarcophagus. It rang sharply against the ancient marble. "I wanted to protect this house," she whispered. "Instead, I stained it." Holmes said nothing, merely extended his hand. She took it, and he guided her wordlessly up the steps. The next morning dawned gray and subdued. The rain had stopped, but the estate bore the heaviness of the revelations unearthed within it. Margaret had been taken into custody, her confession given freely, with no protest or plea for leniency. The constables, alerted by Holmes's earlier telegram, had arrived quietly and respectfully. Lillian stood by the drawing-room window, watching the path disappear into the woods as the carriage bearing Margaret vanished behind the trees. "She was never cruel to me," she said softly. "Only distant, But now I see it was fear. Holmes nodded. Fear and love often make uneasy bedfellows. She turned to him. What happens now? The estate will pass into your stewardship, Holmes said. There may be legal delays, but the ring, the papers your uncle had not yet burned, they all make clear his intent. And the gift? She asked. Holmes smiled faintly. That, Miss Glanville, is yours already. You've carried it all along. That evening, as we prepared to depart Glanville Hall, Holmes lingered one last time before Eleanor Brandt's portrait. The face within the frame seemed calmer now, as though some long-standing grief had finally lifted. She was forgotten, he said quietly, but not lost. Memory, as you said, Watson, is a powerful thing, especially when it refuses to be erased. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. And now? Now, he said, donning his coat. Now we return to Baker Street. I imagine Mrs. Hudson has been wondering what became of us, and I, for one, am in desperate need of tea that isn't steeped in secrets. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Bloodline. It was on the journey back to London, as the train pulled through the pale, mist-hung countryside, that Holmes leaned back in his seat with a peculiar gleam in his eye. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet since our departure from Glanville Hall. His fingers steepled before him in reflection, gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the smudged glass pane. I, on the other hand, was thoroughly exhausted. The affair at Glanville had left an oppressive weight on my spirit, not simply because of Margaret's confession, but because of the generational burden that seemed to haunt those ancient stones. For once, I yearned for the simple predictability of London fog and Baker Street warmth. Holmes, I finally said, setting aside the newspaper I'd been attempting to read. You've been brooding since we left the hall. Is there some loose thread you've not yet pulled? His gaze remained on the window, but his lips curled faintly. A thread, Watson, indeed, but whether it leads to a forgotten hem or a new tapestry, I am not yet certain. I thought the matter concluded. Margaret confessed. The motive is as clear as any, a twisted sense of duty, a fear of displacement. The ring, the codicil, it all fits. Holmes turned then, finally looking at me. It fits, yes, but perhaps too snugly. A confession, while emotionally satisfying, is not always the full truth. Margaret Glanville confessed to a crime, yes, but is it the precise crime we presumed? I frowned. You think she was lying? Not lying, selectively truthful. There is a difference. Before I could question further, he produced a small notebook from his coat pocket, one I had not seen before. He flipped it open to a page filled with the familiar, crisp handwriting I knew to be his own. At the top, Sir Anthony's final days, anomalies. I reviewed the timeline before we left, he said. There are peculiarities we overlooked in the height of our pursuit. For example, did you notice the discrepancy in the date of the codicil Lillian discovered? Yes, it was signed the day before his death, wasn't it? Holmes nodded. Indeed. And yet, Pennington stated Sir Anthony had discussed the codicil's content with him at least a week prior. Why delay the signing? I considered. Perhaps he needed time to gather courage, or to formally have it witnessed. Unlikely. A man as exacting as Sir Anthony would not procrastinate on a matter of inheritance. More curiously, why was the codicil not sent to Pennington the moment it was signed? Why entrust it to the study and not ensure its legal lodgment? Holmes's eyes glinted. Unless, of course, he never intended to send it at all. I sat upright. But that would imply that someone else forged the document. But Lillian said she found it hidden in the base of his desk. Yes, Holmes said, she found it. But someone placed it there. If Margaret truly burned the original, who provided the duplicate? And why would she confess to a crime she didn't commit fully? Silence fell between us, heavy and unexpected. Holmes tapped the notebook. I believe Margaret may have been complicit in a broader deceit, but the fatal blow, Sir Anthony's death, may not have come from her hand at all. I shook my head slowly. But then, who? Holmes looked toward the window once more. To answer that, Watson, we must understand what truly frightened Sir Anthony in his final days. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fog had rolled in thick and yellow, clinging to the city streets like a living thing. Mrs. Hudson welcomed us with relieved exclamations and hot tea, and Holmes, ever gracious in his aloof way, offered his thanks before retreating immediately to his files. He rifled through the folders and notes from old cases with something bordering on urgency. I observed in silence until he unearthed a letter, aged and frayed, marked with the Glanville seal. "This," he said, handing it to me, "arrived at Baker Street 6 months ago." I read it quickly. It was from Sir Anthony himself. "Mr. Holmes, I write not for legal protection, but for clarity. My family is a house of many ghosts, but one among them breathes still. I fear a reckoning is coming, not from strangers, but from within. If I am found dead in circumstances deemed natural or tragic, please consider that it may have been otherwise. I've made arrangements to alter the succession, but doubt remains. Trust no surface truths. Yours, Sir Anthony Glanville." My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the paper. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Holmes shrugged. "At the time, I believed it the ramblings of an aging man haunted by regrets. Now I suspect it was a veiled warning." "And the line, 'A ghost who breathes still'?" Holmes paced. "A figure erased from the records. A person believed dead. Someone with motive to silence Sir Anthony before the change took effect." I felt a slow dread spreading in my chest. "You believe Lillian may not be who she claims?" "No," Holmes said. "I believe someone else claimed to protect her and used her position as a pawn to secure the legacy they wanted preserved." There was a long pause. Then he added, "And only one person knew precisely when Sir Anthony would sign that codicil. One person with access to both Margaret and Lillian. Pennington." Holmes nodded. "He has guided this family's affairs for decades. If anyone could forge a legal document, manipulate a grieving girl, and orchestrate a subtle death." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The next morning, we boarded the first train back to Hampshire. The landscape was unchanged, but our purpose had shifted. When we arrived once more at Glanville Hall, the mood had darkened. News had spread of Margaret's confession, but Lillian remained cloistered inside under Pennington's watchful eye. Holmes led the way straight to the study, where Pennington sat behind the desk, calm as a man with nothing to hide. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "I had not expected your return." Holmes's smile was cold. Truth rarely waits for an invitation. Chapter 11. The Lawyer's Ledger. Pennington did not rise from behind the polished desk. His expression remained neutral, the corners of his mouth drawn in a practiced smile that betrayed nothing, yet revealed much to Sherlock Holmes's discerning eye. The study, once a site of familial retreat and private correspondence, now bore the air of a tribunal chamber. Its very walls seemed to anticipate accusation. Holmes closed the door behind him with quiet precision and stepped into the room with purpose. I followed, my notepad already in hand, instinctively prepared to record whatever revelation might come next. "I take it," Pennington said, folding his hands before him, "that this is not a social call." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "It is a call for truth, one long overdue." The lawyer raised a brow. "Truth, Mr. Holmes, is a matter best left to courts and conscience." "Ah," Holmes said lightly. "But where the courts are slow and conscience convenient, logic must act in their place." I watched Pennington closely. Though his tone was urbane, a flicker of tension appeared at his temple, a slight shift in the angle of his chair. He was bracing. Holmes's presence was no longer a curiosity, but a threat. "I've come," Holmes said, "to discuss Sir Anthony's final days, and, more specifically, the codicil added to his will." Pennington's smile never wavered. "Yes, a matter which Miss Glanville has already confessed to sabotaging, if I'm not mistaken." "That she did," Holmes agreed. "But you and I both know, Mr. Pennington, that her confession was a performance, carefully coached, emotionally raw, but ultimately imprecise. Are you implying—" "I am not implying anything. I'm stating with measured confidence that Margaret Glanville was manipulated into believing she burned the codicil. The truth is far more elaborate, and you, sir, are its architect." Pennington stood abruptly. "That is a serious accusation." "It is," Holmes acknowledged. "One I do not make lightly, but it is supported by facts. For instance, the codicil Lillian discovered bears a signature dated the night before Sir Anthony's death. However, you yourself told me he had made the decision to alter his will a full week prior. And while it is not inconceivable that he delayed signing it, it is curious that the document was hidden rather than sent directly to your office, especially when you, his trusted legal advisor, were already present at Glanville Hall." Pennington exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. "You presume much, Mr. Holmes." Holmes moved closer, hands behind his back. "Not presumption, deduction. You see, I spoke with the notary in Winchester this morning. He confirmed that Sir Anthony had requested a private courier to deliver the updated codicil to your office. That courier never arrived, yet the codicil was found in this study, unsigned until the very night Sir Anthony died." I blinked. "But if he sent it, it was intercepted," Holmes finished. "Pennington ensured the codicil never left the estate. Then, once Sir Anthony was dead, he forged a replacement using knowledge of its content and legal format. Lillian discovered it by accident, which lent it authenticity. It was a gambit to maintain influence, either by positioning Lillian as heir or by controlling her." The lawyer's face had turned an ugly shade of red, but he remained still, calculating. "Even this," Holmes said, lifting a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, "would be enough to make a judge suspicious." He passed the page to Pennington, who unfolded it with a trembling hand. "It's a letter," Holmes said, "from Sir Anthony to me, written 6 months ago. He suspected foul play. He did not trust that he would die by natural causes, and he warned me that if anything were to happen, I should not accept the most convenient explanation." Pennington's eyes skimmed the page, his jaw tightening. "You see," Holmes continued, "Margaret's confession served your purpose beautifully. It cast suspicion on someone emotionally unstable, already overwhelmed with grief and guilt, a perfect scapegoat. But the true author of this drama is you, Mr. Pennington." The silence in the study stretched like a taut string. I could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, sharp as a chisel. Then Pennington chuckled, dry, brittle. "You're a clever man, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but cleverness isn't proof." Holmes nodded. "No, but ledgers are." He strode to the bookcase behind the desk and ran his hand along the spines until he pulled free a volume. It was a faux book, a ledger in disguise. Holmes placed it on the desk and opened it. "Records of Glanville Trust disbursements," he said. "There are irregularities, particularly in the months leading up to Sir Anthony's death. Diversions of funds into a private account held under your name. A name, I might add, that appears on several offshore trusts, all established through your firm." Pennington's breath caught. "You knew Sir Anthony was going to cut off your access to the estate," Holmes said softly. "You'd advised him for decades, grown dependent on the financial entanglements. When he sought to alter the balance of inheritance and grant more to Lillian, perhaps even give her controlling authority, you acted." "And the murder?" I asked, stunned. "Did he poison Sir Anthony as well?" Holmes shook his head. "No. That, I believe, was nature. Sir Anthony was ill. Pennington merely hastened the legal structure of his legacy to serve himself. Pennington's voice emerged hoarse, bitter. "You can't prove forgery." "I don't need to," Holmes replied. "Margaret's statement will be revisited. The notary's testimony will suggest contradiction. The financial trail will indict your motive. But most damning of all, Lillian has requested an audit. She's already spoken to a barrister in London." Pennington collapsed into his chair, defeated. That evening, Holmes and I stood on the drive of Glanville Hall as the police escorted Pennington into the carriage. Margaret watched from the window above, her face pale, unreadable. Lillian stood beside her, not crying, but hollowed by truth. "You saw this coming," I murmured. "No," Holmes said, "but I suspected the pieces did not align. People rarely lie out of malice alone, Watson. More often, they do so out of love or fear." We stood in silence for a moment, the moon rising over the hedgerows, the estate behind us no longer cloaked in secrets, but bathed in the harsh clarity of justice. Chapter 12. The Shadows That Remain. The days that followed Pennington's arrest were thick with uneasy silence. Glanville Hall, once echoing with concealed tension and whispered fears, now stood oddly hollow. Servants moved quietly, unsure whether to grieve the old order or embrace the new. A kind of mourning settled over the place, less for Sir Anthony himself, and more for the illusions his presence had long sustained. Holmes and I remained guests of Lillian at her gentle insistence. She wished, she said, to understand the fullness of what had transpired before the matter could be laid to rest. There were still lingering questions, pieces unaligned in the great mosaic of deception. On the third morning after Pennington's removal, Holmes stood at the threshold of the drawing room, his eyes scanning the empty fireplace and untouched decanters. I joined him a moment later, coffee in hand. "You seem unsettled," I said cautiously. He did not immediately answer. "There is an itch at the back of my mind, Watson. One of those faint disturbances that resists articulation, as if we have solved the crime, but not the cause. But surely Pennington was corrupt, yes. Calculating, greedy, but not murderous. Sir Anthony's death, according to the physician's records and confirmed by the inspector, bears no signs of poisoning or violence. It appears natural. And yet you remain doubtful." Holmes turned from the hearth. "Not doubtful, suspicious. Consider this. Why forge the codicil only if one is certain the original won't reappear? Pennington's scheme required two things: Sir Anthony's death and the complete disappearance of the genuine codicil. He could not risk the original being found after the forgery was introduced." I frowned. "Are you saying he wasn't working alone?" "Precisely. Pennington, cunning though he is, does not strike me as one who would leave loose ends, unless he was assured someone else had tied them for him." Just then, the door opened, and Margaret Glanville stepped in. She was thinner than when we first arrived, drawn around the eyes, her hands nervously clasping a faded shawl. But there was clarity, too. The haze of guilt had lifted, replaced by something quieter and sharper, a bruised dignity. "I heard you were in here," she said softly. "May I?" Holmes gestured toward the chaise. "Please." She sat carefully, smoothing her dress with trembling fingers. "Lillian told me everything. About Mr. Pennington. About the forgery. About what I thought I had done." "There is no blame in you," Holmes said gently. "You acted under the weight of grief and manipulation." Margaret nodded but did not meet his eyes. "And yet I still feel hollow. I remember so little about that night, only that I was in the study, that I smelled ink, that something burned." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Burned?" She nodded. "Yes, I thought it was the codicil, but now I wonder." Holmes stepped closer, kneeling before her. "Miss Glanville, may I ask you something?" When you smelled the burning, was it paper or something else? She blinked, startled. It was sharp, acrid, not like parchment, more like chemicals. Holmes stood. Then I must see the hearth. We moved quickly to the study. The grate had long since been cleaned, but Holmes knelt. Brushing the stones gently, he withdrew a small metal tin from beneath the ashes. "Watson." I crouched beside him. Inside the scorched container were traces of glass, a blackened cloth, and a cork with a faint, oily sheen. "A phial," Holmes said grimly. "Wrapped in linen to delay ignition, and judging by the residue, it contained chloroform, or perhaps ether." He looked up, eyes gleaming. "There was an attempt, Watson. Someone meant to sedate Sir Anthony. Quietly, without confrontation, but they bungled it, perhaps too late to administer it effectively. Or he awoke mid-act and died from the shock." "But who?" I whispered. Holmes rose slowly. "That," he said, "is the last shadow we must chase." Chapter 13. The Sleeper's Breath. We returned to the drawing room in thoughtful silence. The burnt phial and scorched cloth had cast the matter in a grimmer light. Holmes carried the tin in a gloved hand, as though it were some sacred relic unearthed from a tomb. And in a sense, it was. The last whispered breath of a plot still shrouded in deceit. Lillian awaited us by the tall windows, sunlight drawing long, golden lines across her pale blue gown. She turned at our entrance, her brows furrowed at the sight of Holmes's somber expression. "You've found something," she said softly. Holmes nodded, setting the tin upon the table. "The fire in the study did not consume a will, Miss Glanville. It consumed a bottle, a glass phial containing, by my estimation, chloroform, and it was used, or rather intended to be used, on your uncle." Her face paled, the light draining from her cheeks. "Chloroform? But that would mean—" "That someone sought to sedate him," Holmes said, "perhaps to render him unconscious or to create the illusion of a peaceful passing. Only it failed, either through miscalculation or interruption." "But who would—" She trailed off, her lips forming the word without sound. "That is the question which now consumes us," Holmes murmured. A soft knock interrupted the moment. It was Mr. Bletchley, the house steward, an old man with a bowed back and trembling hands. "Beg pardon," he said. "A matter, sir, if I may." Holmes gestured for him to proceed. There's been talk below stairs. The footman, George, mentioned something. Said the night before Sir Anthony died, he saw someone entering the study after midnight. Said he thought it was Miss Glanville, but now he's not so sure." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Not sure? Did he describe anything more?" "Only that whoever it was wore gloves and carried a small case. Leather, square, like a doctor's bag." A silence fell, heavy and sudden. Holmes turned to me, voice tight with realization. "A bag. The same shape that could carry a phial," I added. He turned back to Bletchley. "Where is George now?" "In the servants' hall, sir." "Bring him." The steward shuffled off, and in his absence the air in the drawing room grew brittle with tension. "I assumed it was Margaret who had crept in that night," Lillian said, her voice distant. "But now, you suspect someone else." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he walked to the hearth and stared into the embers of a fire long dead. A moment later, George entered, nervous, young, and pale. "Tell me what you saw," Holmes said without preamble. I was in the corridor outside the study," George stammered. "About midnight. I heard the door open. I ducked into the shadows. I thought it might be Miss Margaret, but this person, he was taller. He wore gloves, sir, dark gloves, and a coat with a velvet collar, and he had a bag. Not large, but just enough to carry something." Holmes leaned forward slightly. Did you see his face? No, sir, but he limped just a little. Not badly, just favoring one foot. A sharp intake of breath from Holmes. He turned to me, voice like iron. Watson, you remember what I said about Pennington's gait? I blinked. He walked evenly. No limp. Precisely. But do you know who does favor his right leg slightly? My breath caught. Dr. Felix Granger, Holmes said grimly. Lillian gasped. But he's been our family physician for years. He delivered me. And that, Holmes said, is why no one would suspect him. A man like Granger would have access to chloroform, the knowledge to use it subtly, and, crucially, a reason to cover his tracks. He turned back to the scorched tin. I believe Dr. Granger entered that room intending to sedate Sir Anthony. Whether for benevolent reasons, to ease his passing, or for something more sinister, we shall soon learn, but what is now clear is this. The key to Sir Anthony's death lies not in the forged will, nor in Margaret's haunted memory, but in the bag of a family doctor who knew too much, or too little. And as the clock struck the hour, its chime reverberated with a foreboding that no comfort could soften. Chapter 14. The Physician's Secret. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather over High Mere. A dull silver light swallowing the warmth from the windows. Holmes had sent for Dr. Felix Granger under the guise of a routine inquiry, and the man arrived promptly, a leather satchel swinging from his hand, eerily similar to the one George had described. Granger was a tall, spare man in his late 50s, with a distinguished air and a neatly trimmed beard. He smiled courteously as he entered the drawing room, but faltered the instant he saw Holmes's expression. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" he asked, the corners of his eyes twitching. "Yes," Holmes replied evenly. "Concerning the night Sir Anthony died." The doctor stiffened slightly. "I've already given my statement to the magistrate." "Indeed. But some new details have come to light. For instance, a witness saw someone enter Sir Anthony's study well after midnight. Someone carrying a satchel. The description of that person fits you rather closely, Doctor." There was a flicker in Granger's gaze, quick and small, but to Holmes it might as well have been a thunderclap. "I frequently carried my satchel in those days," the doctor replied, adjusting his cuffs. "Surely that is no proof of guilt." "No," Holmes said, stepping forward. "But the presence of a scorched file among the ashes in the study fireplace suggests someone tried to destroy evidence, possibly a bottle of chloroform. Chloroform which you, as a physician, would have access to." Granger's throat worked. "Are you accusing me of murder?" Holmes did not flinch. "I'm asking you what you were doing in the study that night." For a long moment the room held its breath. Then Granger sighed heavily and sank into a nearby chair, rubbing his eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he murmured. Watson leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Granger looked up, his voice suddenly hollow. "Sir Anthony was in terrible pain. His breathing had become ragged, his mind fevered. I'd been tending him daily for months, watching him wither. That night he sent word. He said he couldn't bear the agony any longer. He begged me for something stronger. He said he wanted sleep, a deep one." Holmes's face remained unreadable. "And you obliged?" "I brought chloroform, yes. Just enough to help him rest. But when I arrived, he had already taken something else. Laudanum, perhaps. I found him unconscious, barely breathing. I panicked. I feared I would be blamed, that they would think I had administered something lethal. So I destroyed the bottle. I burned it in the hearth." "And the satchel?" Holmes asked. "I left with it as quietly as I came. I told no one. I feared losing my license, my reputation." Lillian, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but firm. "You could have told us. You knew how tormented he was. He might have taken the laudanum himself." I feared it would look like collusion, Granger said wearily. So your family, your uncle's wealth, the will. Holmes turned away, eyes distant. You did not kill him, Doctor, but your silence clouded the truth. The coroner would have noted the traces of chloroform and assumed foul play if it weren't explained. Then, what will you do? Granger asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back. That depends on whether there are more lies yet to be uncovered. A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking clock. Finally, Holmes said, Sir Anthony may have hastened his own end, or perhaps it was accidental, but one thing is clear. His death was not part of the forgery plot. That scheme belongs to another. Granger bowed his head, saying nothing more. Holmes turned to me as we stepped into the hall. Now we must return to the living, and to the will that appeared conveniently just before the fire. And Margaret? I asked. We shall speak with her, he replied. But it is not Margaret I now suspect. His eyes glinted with quiet resolve. It is someone far more cunning and far more invested in appearances than in truth. Chapter 15. The Portrait and the Pen. The morning after Dr. Granger's confession dawned bleak and overcast, the skies above Highmere suspended in tones of pewter and ash. Holmes and I sat across from one another in the small breakfast parlour, the mood subdued, though Holmes's eyes sparkled with the intensity of thought. He toyed absently with a teacup, untouched, while his mind ran far ahead of us all. I believe we are nearing the edge of the veil, Watson, he said suddenly. Dr. Granger's admission brings us clarity, though not closure. You think Sir Anthony's death was unrelated to the forged will? I asked, though I already suspected his answer. Yes, a tragic coincidence, perhaps even self-inflicted, but not murder. And yet, he rose and began pacing. The forged will appeared too conveniently and in the most advantageous light for one person alone. Margaret? I ventured. Holmes paused by the mantel, gaze flicking to the large oil painting of the late Sir Anthony that hung above it. She is a woman of pride and guarded sorrow, but not, I think, criminal ambition. Still, we must be certain. There was a soft knock at the door, and Lillian entered, holding a folded slip of parchment. This was discovered inside the frame of Uncle's portrait, she said. The back panel was loose. I was dusting when I noticed the gap. Holmes took the note from her, unfolding it carefully. The ink was faint but legible. To be opened only in the event of suspicion. A.W. What does it say? I asked as Holmes read. It's a note written by Sir Anthony, he said slowly. He seems to have anticipated something untoward. Listen to this. If ever it should be claimed that a new will was signed by my hand in my final week, know that it is false. My testament remains as filed with Mr. Harrow in London, dated March of last year. Any later claims are forgeries. My seal, kept in the east drawer of my study, must not be mistaken for a signature of consent. Good Lord, I murmured. That confirms it then. Indeed, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Someone forged a will and used the seal to lend it weight. But they did not count on this. Sir Anthony's quiet foresight. A hidden safeguard, placed not among legal records, but inside the frame of his own portrait. Brilliant. Do you think Margaret knew about the true will? Holmes hesitated. No. I believe she believed it genuine. She had motive, perhaps, but not the means to execute such a careful forgery. Her grief is too authentic. No, the culprit is someone who understood the law, who could forge legal phrasing, and had access to both the study and the seal. Lillian looked stricken. Then, are we back to George? Holmes shook his head. George is impetuous, foolish at times, but not capable of this level of deceit. No, the truth lies somewhere between the ink and the ambition. We need to examine that forged will again. Within the hour, we were in the library. The false will spread before us on the large oak desk. Holmes had brought a magnifying lens and a series of comparison documents from the bureau upstairs. He worked silently, eyes flitting from seal to script, from name to date. "There," he said at last, pointing to the second paragraph. "Note the phrasing here, hereunto in full awareness of my faculties. A rather florid turn, isn't it?" "Yes," I nodded. "I recall that phrase. I've seen it somewhere before." "As have I. In fact, that exact phrase appears in a legal brief drafted by Mr. Percival Harrow 2 years ago in a case involving Sir Anthony's former land agent. The style is distinctive." "But Harrow holds the original will," I said. "Surely he wouldn't—" Holmes smiled thinly. "No, but his former clerk, Mr. Edwin Bletchley, was dismissed under quiet circumstances last year. Fraudulent use of office stationery, if I recall. He would have known the phrasing, had access to the seal's impression on past documents, and perhaps harbored resentment or greed." "You think he's behind the forgery?" "I believe so. And I believe he planted the false will after the fire, assuming no one would question its emergence amidst the ashes. But he made a critical error. He misjudged Sir Anthony's foresight." Lillian stepped closer, her voice quiet. "Can he be found?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "He must be. For the law may be slow, but it is not blind, and this trail is now far too clear to ignore." Outside, the first drops of rain began to strike the tall windows, the sound rhythmic, like a ticking clock approaching its final chime. Chapter 16. The Man with the Seal. The rain had settled into a persistent rhythm by the time Holmes and I reached the modest solicitor's office of Percival Harrow in London. The lamps within flickered behind frosted glass, the atmosphere hushed and civilized, yet tense with expectation. Holmes's cane tapped sharply against the tiled floor as we were ushered into a room lined with shelves of case files and parchment-bound ledgers. Mr. Harrow, an aging man with pinched features and a deep widow's peak, looked up from behind his desk, startled but courteous. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson, I wasn't expecting a visit. This concerns Sir Anthony's estate, I presume." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. You were the custodian of Sir Anthony's original will, were you not?" "Yes. It is still in my possession. Filed and sealed." "Why?" "There has been an attempt to replace it with a forged version," Holmes replied crisply. "A forgery created by someone with intimate familiarity with your phrasing and access to official formatting. Perhaps someone once in your employ." Harrow's face clouded. "I see. You mean Bletchley?" "Precisely." The solicitor sighed and removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "A brilliant clerk, but dangerously reckless. He was dismissed quietly after we discovered he'd been mimicking my signature on minor client memos. Nothing of criminal weight, but certainly cause for concern." "Do you know his whereabouts?" "I believe he took lodgings in Clerkenwell. Last I heard, he was attempting to work freelance under a false name. Something like Mr. Ellis." Holmes's expression sharpened. "That will suffice. One final question. Was Bletchley aware of Sir Anthony's affairs beyond the will?" "Yes. He occasionally handled copywork for the family's land holdings and had access to archival materials. He might have seen the seal, the phrasing, even an earlier draft of the will." As we stepped outside into the drizzle, Holmes turned to me. "We must move swiftly, Watson. Bletchley has made a critical mistake, but he may yet try to cover his tracks. A cornered man with nothing to lose can be most dangerous." We made our way to Clerkenwell, a district known for its maze of narrow alleys and densely packed terraces. It was nearing dusk when we found the building, a narrow brick structure tucked between a watchmaker and a grocer, with fading numbers painted on the door. Holmes knocked, firm and deliberate. A lanky man with a sparse beard opened the door. He looked older than his years, his eyes red-rimmed and darting, his collar unbuttoned. "Mr. Edwin Bletchley?" Holmes asked without preamble. "Who's asking?" the man replied, already attempting to close the door. Holmes slipped his boot into the gap. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This concerns a forged will and the death of Sir Anthony Wyndham." The man's face drained of color. He backed away slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for a half-packed valise on a table behind him. "There's no need for dramatics, Mr. Sir Bletchley," Holmes said calmly. "The note concealed behind Sir Anthony's portrait has rendered your document null, but the law would still prefer your confession over pursuit." "I didn't," Bletchley began, then faltered. "I didn't kill him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I never said you did. But forging a will is a crime that carries weighty consequences. You took a chance on the fire hiding your deception. Unfortunately, it revealed it instead." "I needed the money," Bletchley muttered, sagging into the chair by the wall. He was going to cut Margaret off entirely. "I heard it through Harrow's notes. I thought if she inherited something, she might share it. She always spoke kindly of me once." "So you crafted the will?" I asked. He nodded. "I copied the phrasing from Harrow's old briefs." "The seal?" "I traced it from a document I swiped when I left. I thought it was watertight. No one was supposed to look too closely." "You underestimated Sir Anthony," Holmes said. "He had prepared for such an attempt." Bletchley gave a bitter laugh. "Seems like he prepared for everyone, even me." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe it's time we return to Wyndham Hall. The storm has begun to clear, and with it, the truth." As we stepped back into the wet evening, Holmes spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "Justice, Watson, is not always a spectacle of grand motives and villains in shadow. Sometimes it is a quiet clerk with a wounded pride and a borrowed phrase. But even those leave footprints behind. And with the forged will exposed, the pieces of the Wyndham mystery were now aligned. Only one final act remained, to unveil the hidden consequences that the truth would stir within the family left behind. Chapter 17. Echoes in the Ashes. The road back to Wyndham Hall shimmered with fresh rain, the puddles catching reflections of a reddening sky. Though the storm had passed, the house still bore its wounds. The singed scent of smoke clung faintly in the corridors, and the charred remnants of the west wing stood like a mausoleum to the night's violence. Holmes and I arrived just before twilight. Margaret was in the drawing-room, seated by the hearth with a decanter of sherry at her elbow, her eyes dark with sleepless worry. The fire cast long shadows against the cracked plaster, and above it the portrait of Sir Anthony, now rehung after the damage, regarded us with somber dignity. "You've returned," she said, setting down her glass. Holmes inclined his head. "With answers, Miss Wyndham, or rather, with confirmation of what your father already suspected." She stiffened slightly. "The will?" "A forgery," Holmes said. "Crafted by Edwin Bletchley. He admitted to using phrasing and seals stolen from Harrow's files to produce it. Your father's real will remains untouched, preserved by Harrow himself." Margaret's lips parted in shock. "Then, my inheritance?" "You inherit nothing," Holmes said gently. "The estate passes to the Crown. Your father's final will rescinded any family claims, though I believe Mr. Harrow may yet make an appeal on your behalf for a modest stipend." She turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. I knew he was angry. But to disown me entirely. Holmes approached the fire and looked up at the portrait. "Your father was not cruel, Miss Wyndham, only deliberate. He knew someone would attempt to alter his legacy after his death. That is why he concealed the note behind the painting. It was a message to those who might presume to outwit him." Margaret rose. "Then why not simply confront me? Why this silent punishment?" "He feared that confrontation would drive you further from him," Holmes said quietly. "Your entanglement with Lord Hensley, the debts, the rumors. He saw a pattern repeating, and he feared for you. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then why leave me with nothing? Because I suspect he hoped that by doing so you might find your own means, your own strength, Holmes replied. It was not generosity he withheld, but control. Perhaps in his own way, that was love. For a long moment, Margaret stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. And the fire? Accidental, Holmes said. Likely caused by the lightning storm, striking the iron chimney in the west wing. A terrible coincidence, but it is what drew attention to the forgery. There was a silence then, heavy with unsaid things. Holmes turned away from the hearth and approached the writing desk where the false will had been discovered. One question remains, he said, lifting the drawer gently. Why was the forged document placed so clumsily here? It's unlike Bletchley to be careless. Margaret said nothing. Holmes looked at her steadily. Did you plant it? Her shoulders tensed. I suspected the real will might be unfavorable. I asked Bletchley if there was another. He said he had a copy. I didn't ask questions. I simply wanted to believe. You hoped the fire would bury the truth. She hesitated. I didn't set the fire, Mr. Holmes. I swear it, but I won't deny I thought it might simplify matters. Holmes regarded her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Intent carries weight, Miss Wyndham, but so does grief and desperation. He turned to me then. Come, Watson, our work here is done. Let the family reckon with its own ghosts. As we stepped once more into the dim hallway, the echo of our footsteps seemed to mingle with those who had walked Wyndham Hall before. Lords, soldiers, debtors, dreamers, all leaving their mark upon its age-worn stones. Behind us, the house was still, but not quiet. It breathed again, not with vengeance, but with the long, sighing exhale of a mystery finally facing the light. Chapter 18. The Last Testament. A week later, the morning fog curled thickly over Baker Street, clinging to the eaves and chimneys like a reluctant ghost. Holmes sat at his usual post by the window, the newspapers splayed out before him, untouched. A single letter rested open on the table. He had read it thrice already, though not a muscle in his face betrayed what it contained. I entered with 2 steaming cups of coffee, setting one beside him. News from Wyndham? He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the drifting smoke outside. Margaret Wyndham has left the country. Truly? I asked, raising a brow. To where? Vienna, he said. It seems Mr. Harrow has arranged for her to study under the patronage of an art restoration institute. The real estate from the estate's minor holdings was quietly liquidated. No legal inheritance, of course. But the Crown saw fit to grant her a small stipend for moral restitution. An elegant solution. Holmes let out a dry hum. Elegant, perhaps, though not undeserved. She did not forge the will, but she was complicit in its presentation. Her father's final blow struck deep, yet in a way it may have freed her. She leaves not in disgrace, but with a chance at rebuilding herself, without the weight of the Wyndham name. He took the cup and sipped, then leaned back in the chair with a faint sigh. It is not often, Watson, that we see a case where justice and mercy find equal footing. I reached for the newspaper. And what of Bletchley? Holmes smiled thinly. Released. His confession was not coerced, but the magistrate ruled that his remorse, and the small fortune he turned over, lessened the need for imprisonment. He will never practice law again, of course. He has returned to his sister's farm in Shropshire. I nodded slowly, recalling the man's strained face, the sweat on his brow as Holmes extracted the truth. He'll live with his conscience. Holmes's fingers drummed once on the windowsill. As must we all. The silence stretched for a moment. I ventured, and the true will, what did it say? He gave me a sidelong glance. You already suspect, don't you? I suspect, I said, that it was never meant to be executed. Correct. Holmes folded his hands. The real will disinherited not only Margaret, but all known descendants, beneficiaries, and even institutions tied to the Wyndham names. Sir Anthony meant for Wyndham Hall to die with him. I stared. But why? Holmes stood and moved to the mantel. From a drawer, he drew a copy of the letter Sir Anthony had hidden behind the portrait. He wrote this weeks before his death. Listen, to live surrounded by ghosts is no life at all. This house is a reliquary of misdeeds and squandered legacy. Let the fire consume it, let the wind scatter its ashes. I leave no wealth to prolong the illusion of nobility, only silence. That is my final gift. I felt a chill. Holmes tapped the letter. He understood that legacy is not what we leave behind in stone or coin, but what we end. We sat for some time in silence, the quiet of our rooms holding the weight of Wyndham's tragedy. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the distant outlines of hansoms rolling toward their unknown destinations. At last, Holmes said, "You asked me once what the most elusive motive in all of crime is." I looked up. "I did?" He nodded. "It is not greed, Watson, nor love, not revenge or even fear. It is shame. Shame drives people to silence, to burying truths beneath lies, to destroying what they once cherished. Sir Anthony was ashamed of his choices, his heirs, and his inheritance. Margaret, too, felt it, not only for what she had done, but for what she had become. And yet, I murmured, she may still be redeemed. May, Holmes said, being the operative word. He turned back to the window, folding his hands behind his back. The light had strengthened now, and even the fog was giving way to a crisp blue morning. A new day had begun, untethered from Wyndham's ghosts. And though Holmes rarely dwelled on sentiment, I could sense that this case, like few before, had touched something deeper in him. Not admiration, not pity, but a kind of solemn respect for the quiet battles fought in secret and for the courage it takes to walk away from ruin instead of rebuilding it. "Come, Watson," he said suddenly, reaching for his coat. "There's word of a locked room affair near Hampstead involving a bishop and a missing falcon." I blinked. Already. He grinned faintly. "The game, my friend, never pauses. It only waits for the next worthy player." And so we stepped once more into the London mist, two seekers chasing shadows, bringing light not to those who asked for it, but to those who needed it most. Wyndham Hall faded behind us, as all ghosts do, but its lesson, I knew, would remain long after the case was closed.